Let's talk pastels while I show you how I did this landscape. Hi, Shanna Rowe Jackson here from Caution Artists at Play, and today I am playing with pastels. This is actually my first time ever posting a pastel-themed video on my channel, I believe, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about pastels in general and the different options there are on the market. I am doing a landscape right now, and I'm working from my own reference photo. This is actually a quick reference photo that I took from the passenger seat of my car as me and my husband were going somewhere. So this was like on the go. This is one reason why I think it's great that we have cell phones and we have a camera right handy, and cell phones tend to take pretty quick pictures. So keep your phone out whenever you're on a road trip because you never know what kind of shot you can get right from the car. Okay, so I am actually using various pastels in this, so I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the different kinds of pastels that I'm using and what the difference is between them. So pastels are a highly pigmented art supply, and they're made up of dry powdered pigments with a minimal amount of binder. So they're very highly pigmented, so you can get very vibrant colors very quickly. There are a couple different kinds of pastels. There's hard pastels, which have a little bit more binder and less pigment than soft pastels do, which makes them a little bit easier to get fine lines with, but they're not as easy to blend and they're not as vibrant as soft pastels. There are a few different brands of hard pastels out there. The Faber-Castell Polychromos pastels are hard pastels. The Prismacolor New pastels are hard pastels. And I want to say that the Conti crayons are hard pastels, or they're similar to hard pastels. And those are all kind of a chalk form of pastel. However, you can also get some chalk pastels that are considered soft pastels, and those will be very similar in feeling. They'll still have the chalky feel, but they will blend out more easily than their harder brothers, which are the hard pastels, obviously. So that being said, there are also more creamier pastels that are not chalky, and those would be the soft pastels like the Unison or the Sennelier or the Koh-i-Noor extra soft pastels, and those are more like a crayon form. I don't know how to explain it. They're not oil pastels, but they're very, very creamy and not chalky like the other pastels that I just described, and those are going to be usually more expensive, and they're very highly pigmented, and they are a dream to blend. So that's going to be more your artist brand pastels. So the main difference between expensive pastels such as the Sennelier and less expensive pastels like the New Pastel, other than the fact that the New Pastels are more chalky and harder, is going to be the quality of pigments that are being used. So if you are somebody who has started out with pastel, but you're using the cheaper pastels, you might notice that the colors aren't as vibrant as some of the work you see done online by other artists who are using soft pastels. And there's going to be more binder to pigment ratio. In less expensive pastels, there's going to be more binder than there is going to be pigment. So that's automatically going to make it so that they're not as vibrant as some of your more expensive pastels. Another main difference between expensive pastels and inexpensive pastels is going to be the fact that there may not be any light fast testing done on them. That's not to say that they aren't necessarily light fast, it's just that we have no way of knowing if they're light fast because the company didn't have the money to go and do the light fast testing and hasn't told us what their light fast results are. So you're kind of gambling a little bit when you do that, because if you want to sell your artwork, you want it to last, you don't want it to fade. So light fast results are very important. That being said, pastels is one of those mediums that is still very vibrant, even if you're using inexpensive materials. Like if you use cheap colored pencils, a lot of times you can tell that you've used cheap colored pencils. Like if you're using Crayola and you put it up next to Polychromos, you're going to be able to tell. However, with some of the pastels, I've noticed that they're still very, very vibrant, even if they're inexpensive. So there's really nothing wrong with starting out with the cheaper things until you're used to the medium and until you know exactly how the medium works, and then upgrading later on. I think that it's one of those mediums that you really just can't lose with when it comes to that. A couple of other kinds of pastels out there would be the pastel pencils, and those are very similar. I think that the core feels very similar to hard pastels, and you can sharpen them just like you would any other pencil. Well, okay, not just like you would any other pencil. Sometimes they're very difficult to sharpen without breaking, but there are sharpeners out there that can do it. For instance, I have an X-Acto electric sharpener. I'll link it in the description below. I can't remember the exact name of it. That sharpens my pastel pencils without breaking them, and that's probably the first sharpener I've ever found. A lot of other people like to sharpen their pastel pencils with an X-Acto knife. I don't have the patience for that, nor do I have the coordination, and I just feel like I would probably end up hurting myself. So I definitely prefer to use my sharpener for those. But pastel pencils work really well. You can see that I'm using them quite a bit here. They work well for detail, and they are able to be blended out as well, so you can do larger areas with them if you want. Like, you could do a whole piece using just pastel pencils if you wanted to. But I always end up, when I do pastels, I always end up using a combination of pastels. And then another form that you can now get, which is a newer form, but I'm sure many of you have heard of, are the pan pastels. And these are soft pastels, but in pan form. I liken them to, like, I think of them as like eyeshadow. They look like eyeshadow to me, but they are awesome to work with. They are a compressed pastel that is put into little plastic pans, and then you use them very similarly as you would makeup. You actually use tools that look like makeup tools, and you spread it around. So you'll see me doing that here too. I did that for the grass and for parts of the sky. And the brands that I'm using right now, as far as the tools that I'm using, are, I'm using the Sennelier soft pastels. I'm using some of the pan pastels, as I mentioned. I'm using Derwent and Faber-Castell pastel pencils, and I am also using some of the Conti crayons. So I'm just going back and forth with these, and I'm usually going with my thinner layers of pastel underneath. So I'm laying down thin layers of my pan pastels, and I'm going over it with details after. I am using Pastel matte for the first time. This is the first time I've used Pastel matte for pastel, or in general, I think, for any project. And I am in love with this paper. So I'm just going through, obviously, and doing some details in those trees. That was probably the hardest part. I had a very hard time getting fine details. Even though these trees are slightly blurred in my reference photo, I wanted to get the details of the shadows in there, and I went back and forth on these trees quite a bit, and I still was never fully satisfied with them. But that's because this is so small, and I had just a hard time getting in there, even with the pencil, so that I could get the layers that I needed and to, you know, really just get that detail in there. If I had done this on a larger surface, I don't think that it would have been an issue. And that's really the only place I had an issue. I think I just must have been in a funk that day, really. But you can get fine detail, obviously, with pastels, which is why they make so many different forms. And the main thing to remember when doing a landscape like this is that your composition is always going to be perspective based. Even if you don't have like something like a building in it that's going to have obvious perspective, you're going to have atmospheric perspective. And that's what I'm doing here. So if you notice, the clouds get closer together as they get further away, and they get smaller. And then as they're closer to the viewer towards the top of the page, they're going to get larger and more spread out. That is one form of perspective. The other form of perspective is where it gets lighter towards the horizon and then starts to get darker as it gets towards the viewer. So that's something else to keep in mind. Anytime you do a landscape, it's most likely going to be lighter towards the horizon. Your horizon line is the furthest away from the viewer. So that's where the most distance is going to be. There's going to be more air and more molecules and more, you know, vapor between you and that mountain, for instance. So you want to make sure that everything gets lighter as it gets closer to the horizon line. The mountains in the back have a little bit of a blue haze over them, which also helps with perspective. So whenever you're doing something that you want to show distance in and you're doing a landscape, it helps to take the thing that's furthest away and take part of the sky color and glaze it over it. So if you were working in acrylic, you could use a glaze. In this case, I'm just using colors from the sky and putting them directly into the mountain. But there are many ways you can achieve that. You just always want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're painting or drawing any type of landscape. So those are just some things to keep in mind while you're doing a landscape. Another way that I'm showing perspective is when I do the grass, you'll see that I'm using a lot of horizontal lines to create the impression of grass in the background. And that's because when it's further away, you're not going to be able to see individual blades of grass. So I'm just using horizontal lines, and similarly to the clouds, they are getting closer together as they get further away, and they are getting farther apart as they get closer to us. And you'll see that here. I start to do that right now. And when you're drawing grass at a distance, like I mentioned, you're not going to see individual blades of grass because it's so far away, but you may see the impression of clumps because it is still three-dimensional. There is going to be a lot of depth within the grass itself, so you're going to see shadows and highlights. And those will be the things that stand out the most when detail doesn't. Anytime you're doing any type of realism, you really want to pay close attention to your values because sometimes that's all you have to show that there's something in a three-dimensional form. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm paying attention to my reference photo, I'm looking for those shadows, and then I'm just putting them in as I need to. And if I need to lighten things back up, I'm going back over with a lighter color to bring back the highlight if I need to. So I just go back and forth with my values, just to create these small little impressions. And sometimes a clump of grass will look like a dot from far away. Sometimes it will look like a line. So you just pay attention to your reference photo and do the best you can. And again, this is not going to be perfect. I am not going to copy my reference exactly because I know that I can get realistic results without having to copy it exactly. Landscapes are not perfect. It's nature, and so there's a little bit more leeway here than if I were doing, say, a portrait or something like that. So there are times when I change things up from my reference photo. As usual, you hear me talk about that in my videos all the time. I just do what I see fit, and I use the knowledge that I have, and at some points, I do like to steer a little bit away from my reference photo if I think it will make a better drawing in the end. That's usually towards the end of things. I usually use my reference for the most part with most of the rendering. But again, I'm not trying to be exact. I'm not going to be too fussy about it because it's a landscape. I know that's a little contradictory, but the reference is there when you need it. And if you think that there's something in the reference that doesn't fit, then feel free to change it. So I'm going in and just creating those shadows again. And this one was a lot of fun for me. This actually didn't take me very long at all to achieve. And that's another thing that is so great about pastels. It is so much quicker than colored pencil. So much quicker. And I love colored pencil. Colored pencil is one of my top favorite mediums of all time. But it's nice to take a break from it every once in a while and do quicker mediums, which is what you've been seeing me do this summer. I've been doing a lot of different mediums this summer because I've been wanting to try out some supplies that I haven't had the chance to use a lot of. And this is one reason why I did this pastel piece. It's been probably a couple years since I've worked in pastel, so this was a lot of fun for me to do. Something else I want to mention when it comes to working in pastels, and keep this in mind, I'm not a pastel expert because it's never been my main medium, so there are other pastel artists out there who probably know a little bit better about pastels, but you don't want to be inhaling the dust that comes from pastel. They are quite dusty. You probably shouldn't have any pets in the room while you're using them. You want to make sure you clean your work area after you're done. I actually wear a respirator mask, which I'll link in the description below, to help keep particles out, because in the past when I've worked with pastels, I have noticed that I get some gunk in my throat and in my nose after, like I notice I'm stuffier after using them. So that's something to keep in mind, that, you know, when you're working with these, you just want to be safe about it, because you're not supposed to be breathing in anything that's not air to begin with, but you certainly don't want to be breathing in some of these pigments because some of them could be poisonous to you. So I wear a mask when I work with pastels. It can be a little bit uncomfortable at times, but it's such a quick medium that I know that I'm not going to be having to wear the mask for very long. But other people may not, you know, and that's fine too. Everybody has their own working preferences. I just don't like the feeling I get in my nose and in my throat after I work with them. They also say you should never blow the pastel dust off your surface. You should tap your drawing down so that the particles fall down. Again, there are other experts out there who could tell you more about it. And this is the final piece. I hope that you've enjoyed this and that I have taught you something that you didn't necessarily know about pastels. I will link all the items in the description below. This is not a sponsored video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like what you see, please hit subscribe. Also, if you're interested in seeing more of my artwork, I'm on social media, so check out the links in the description below.